The rise of 19th century nationalism and the quest for unified national governments led to a remarkable consolidation of nation states during the 12 years after 1859. Notable political unifications and reforms in Europe during this period included the formation of new German Empire, a unified kingdom of Italy, the dual monarchy of Austria, Hungary, and the introduction of drastic internal changes in Tsarist Russia. Although this chapter focuses mainly on national consolidations within Europe, it should be noted that the unification of larger European states was part of a wider global pattern that included the triumph of central authority after a civil war in the United States, the creation of an independent United Dominion of Canada, and the emergence of a modernizing government and economy in the Empire of Japan. All these disparate events were influenced and advanced by the development of new technologies, such as the railroad, steamship, and telegraph. The communication of ideas, exchange of goods, and movement of people over wide areas became more frequent and easier than ever before. New technologies and the rapid expansion of new industries strengthened the political power of nation-states, which gained increasing influence in the evolving social, economic, and cultural life of all modern societies. 63. Backgrounds: the idea of the nation-state. Before 1860, there were two prominent, relatively coherent nation-states in Europe: Great Britain and France. Spain, united on the map, was internally so fragmented as to belong to a different category. Portugal, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the Scandinavian 547 countries were nation-states, but small or peripheral in this era to the main national centers of European power. The characteristic political organizations were small states comprising fragments of a nation, such as were strewn across the middle of Europe: Hanover, Baden, Sardinia, Tuscany, or the Two Sicilies, and large sprawling empires made up of all sorts of peoples, distantly ruled from above by dynasties and 984 bureaucracies, such as the Romanov, Habsburg, and Ottoman domains. Except for recent developments in the Americas, the same mixture of small non-national states and of large non-national empires was to be found in most of the rest of the world. Since the later 19th century, a nation-state system has prevailed as the main form of governmental power, even where later international alliances and free trade agreements have expanded all kinds of transnational exchanges. The consolidation of large nations became a model for other peoples large and small. In time, in the following century, other large groups of people undertook to establish nation-states as they gained independence from European colonial empires in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Small and middle-sized populations increasingly thought of themselves as nations, entitled to their own political sovereignty and independence. Some of these sovereignties that emerged after 1945 comprised fewer people than a single modern city. The idea of the nation-state has thus served both to bring people together into larger units and to break them apart into smaller ones. In the 19th century, outside the disintegrating Ottoman Empire, from which Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania became independent, and in which an Arab national movement also began to stir, the national idea served mainly to create larger units in place of small ones. The map of Europe from 1871 to 1918 was the simplest it has ever been before or since. See map 500 to 571. Unity and disunity. This book has already had much to say about the idea of the nation-state and the emergence of modern nationalisms. Earlier chapters have described the ferment of national ideas and political movements stirred up by the French Revolution and by the Napoleonic domination of Europe. The nationalist agitation and repression of nationalism in the years after 1815, and the general failure to achieve popular nationalist aspirations in Germany, Italy, and Central Europe in the Revolution of 1848. For many in the 19th century, nationalism became a kind of 985 modern secular faith, and it spread throughout most of Europe, stimulating an emotion-laden desire for national unity, independence, and the creation of a national state that could embody and protect a distinctive national culture. For most devout nationalists, the nation represented higher truths as well as collective and personal aspirations for a better future life. Characteristics of nation-states. A nation-state may be thought of as one in which supreme political authority somehow rests upon and represents the will and feeling of its inhabitants. There must be a people, not merely a swarm of human beings. As Louis Kossuth and other nationalists asserted in the revolutions of 1848, people must feel some common cultural and political identity and have the will to create a sovereign government. They must sense that they belong, that they are members of a community, participating somehow in a common social and cultural life, that the government is their government, and that outsiders are foreign. The outsiders or foreigners are usually, though not always, those who speak a different language. The nation is usually, though not always, composed of persons sharing the same speech. A nation may also possess a belief in common descent or racial origin, however mistaken, or a sense of a common history, remembered as coherent and purposeful, a common future, a common religion, a common geographical home, or a common external menace. Nations take form in many ways, but the people in all nations are alike in feeling or imagining themselves 548 to be communities, permanent communities in which individual persons, together with their children and their children's children, are committed to a collective destiny on Earth. Such beliefs in a shared collective culture do not arise spontaneously in large populations. They develop over time and are sustained by the social networks in which individuals go about 986 their daily lives. People learn to identify with their nations as they grow up in the families, schools, social organizations, religious institutions, and holiday rituals that shape a sense of selfhood in modern human societies. In the 19th century, governments found that they could not effectively rule or develop the full powers of state except by enlisting this sense of membership and support among their subjects. The consolidation of large nation-states had two distinguishable phases. Territorially, it meant the union of pre-existing smaller states. Politically and psychologically, it meant the creation of new ties between government and governed, the admission of new segments of the population to political life, through the expansion of education and through the creation or extension of liberal and representative institutions. This process of national integration and institution building was repeated in widely disparate cultures, ranging from Western Europe and Tsarist Russia to Japan and the frontier societies of North America. Although there was considerable variation in the real power of the new political institutions and in the extent of actual self-government within the different nations, parliaments were set up for the new Italy, the new Germany, the new Japan, the new Canada, and there was eventually movement in Russia in the same direction. In Europe, some of the nationalist aims that the revolutionists had failed to achieve in 1848 were now brought about by the established authorities. Consolidation and constitutionalism. They were brought about, however, only through a series of wars. To create an all-German or an all-Italian state, as the revolutions of 1848 had already shown, it was necessary to break the power of Austria, render Russia at least temporarily ineffective, and overthrow or intimidate those German and Italian governments that refused to surrender their sovereignty. For almost 40 years after 1815, there had been no war between established powers of Europe. Then in 1854 came the Crimean War, in 1859 the Italian War, in 1864 the Danish War, in 1866 the Austro-Prussian War, and in 1870 the Franco-Prussian War. 987 concurrently, the Civil War in the United States maintained national unity by suppressing a secessionist movement for Southern independence. After 1871, for 43 years there was again no war in Europe between the major European powers. The Crimean War, 1854 to 1856. Before moving on to the first of the national consolidation movements, the Italian, we must examine the Crimean War, which, though seemingly remote to most Europeans, helped to make possible the success of the European national movements. Its chief political significance for Europe was that it seriously weakened both Austria and Russia, the two powers most bent on preserving the peace settlement of 1815 and on preventing national changes. The Crimean War also had significant cultural and social influences, however, because it became a new kind of modern national war in which telegraph communications kept the civilian populations of the Western belligerent powers more immediately informed about distant military campaigns. It was the first war covered by newspaper correspondents, and the first to be portrayed to non-combatants in the visual images of early photography. And it was the first war in which women, led by Britain's Florence Nightingale, established their position as army nurses. 549. The pressure of Russia upon Ottoman Turkey was an old story. Every generation saw its Russo-Turkish War. In the last Russo-Turkish War, to go back no further than 1828 to 1829, Tsar Nicholas I protected the independence newly won by Greece and annexed the left bank of the mouth of the Danube. Now, in 1853, Nicholas again made demands upon the still large but weakened Ottoman Empire, moving in on the two Danubian principalities, Wallachia and Moldavia, later to be known as Romania, with military forces, see map P 675. The dispute this time ostensibly involved the protection of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, including the foreign Christians at Jerusalem and in Palestine. Over these Christians, the French also claimed a certain protective jurisdiction. The French had for centuries been the Western European people who were 988 most engaged in the Middle East. They had often furnished money and advisors to the Ottoman Sultan. They carried on a huge volume of trade. They staffed and financed Christian missions, and they often talked of building a Suez Canal. Napoleon III thus had his own aspirations in the Eastern Mediterranean, and he encouraged the Ottoman government to resist Russian claims to protect Christians within the Ottoman Empire. War between Russia and Turkey broke out late in 1853. In 1854, France joined the side of the Turks, as did Great Britain, whose settled policy was to uphold Ottoman Turkey and the Middle East against any Russian expansion. The two Western powers were soon joined by a small ally, the Kingdom of Sardinia, better known because of its Italian mainland territory and seat of government as Piedmont. Sardinia had no visible interest in the issues in the Middle East, but it entered the war as a means to influence the Italian question. Russian pressure. The British fleet successfully blockaded Russia in both its Baltic and Black Sea outlets. French and British armies invaded Russia itself, landing in the Crimean Peninsula, to which all the important fighting was confined. The Austrian Empire had its own reasons to oppose Russian expansion into Ottoman territories, and the Austrians did not want Russia to conquer the Balkans, or to see Britain and France master the situation alone. Austria, therefore, though still recovering from the recent upheaval of 1848-1849, mobilized its armed forces at a great effort to itself and occupied Wallachia and Moldavia, which the Russians evacuated under this threat of attack by a new enemy. Tsar Nicholas died in 1855, and his successor, Alexander II, sued for peace. Peace in 1856 989A, Congress of all the great powers made a peace treaty at Paris in 1856, pledging jointly to maintain the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. The Russian tide ebbed a little. Russia ceded some territory to Moldavia and gave up its claim to the special protection of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Moldavia and Wallachia, united as Romania in 1858, together with Serbia, were recognized as self-governing principalities under protection of the European powers. At the Congress of Paris, European diplomacy seemed to be achieving a more harmonious international system. But trouble was in the making. Napoleon III needed glory. The Italians wanted some kind of unified Italy. The Prussians, who had done nothing in the Crimean War and were only tardily invited to the Congress of Paris, feared that their status as a great power might be slipping away. Napoleon III, the Italian nationalists, and the Prussians all stood to gain by change. Change in Central Europe and Italy meant a tearing up of the Treaty of Vienna of 1815, long guarded by Metternich and unsuccessfully challenged by the revolutionaries of 1848. Now, after the Crimean War, the forces opposing change were very weak. It was the Russian and Austrian empires that had stood firmly for the status quo. But these two powers, which had most seriously attempted to uphold the Vienna settlement, could do so no longer. The first proof came in Italy. 550-990. The Crimean War weakened the international position of Austria and Russia, but its most enduring effect on nations such as Britain may have come in the ways that wars were described in the popular press and in the new role of women nurses. Florence Nightingale arrived in the Crimea with 36 nurses and was at first opposed by army doctors. She is pictured here in one of the hospitals where she began to create the new military and social identity of the female nurse. Time Life Pictures, Getty Images. 64. Cavour and the Italian War of 1859, the unification of Italy. Italian nationalism, the program of Cavour. In Italy, there had long been about a dozen sizable states, together with a few very small ones. Several of them had dissolved in the wars of the French Revolution, and all had been reorganized, first by Napoleon and then by the Congress of Vienna. The governments of these states were generally content with their autonomy and independence, but the governments were remote from their peoples. There was a widespread disgust in Italy with the existing authorities and a growing desire for a liberal national state in which all Italy might be embodied, and through which the Italian grandeur of ancient times and of the Renaissance might be resurrected. This sentiment, the dream of an Italian risorgimento, or resurgence, had become very heated at the time of the French Revolution and Napoleon, and had then been transformed by the writings of Mazzini and other nationalists into an intensely moral campaign for Italian national unity. Mazzini had seen his hopes for a unified republic in Italy elevated for a brief moment and then blasted in the general debacle of 1848. In the stormy events of 1848, the Pope had vehemently rejected the radical romantic republicanism of Mazzini and Garibaldi and turned against the whole cause of Italian nationalism. The same events had shown that Austria could not be ousted from the Italian peninsula without the aid of an outside power. These lessons were not lost on the Prime Minister of Piedmont, Camillo de Cavour, one of the shrewdest political tacticians of that or any age. Serving as prime minister for almost 10 years after 1852, Cavour was a mid-century liberal who wanted Piedmont to be a model of modern progress, efficiency, and fair government that other Italians would admire. He worked hard to establish modern parliamentary practices in a constitutional monarchy under King Victor Emmanuel. He favored the building of railroads and docks, the improvement of agriculture, and emancipation of trade. He followed a strongly anti-clerical policy, cutting down the number of religious holidays, limiting the right of church bodies to own real estate, abolishing the church courts, all without negotiation with the Holy See. A liberal constitutional monarchist and a wealthy landowner in his own right, he had no sympathy for the revolutionary, romantic, and republican nationalism of Mazzini. Cavour shared in the new post-1848 realism described in the last chapter. He did not idealize war, but was willing to make war to unify Italy under the royal family of Savoy. With unruffled calculation, he took Piedmont into the Crimean War, sending troops to Russia in the hope of winning a place at the peace table and raising the Italian question at the Congress of Paris. It was evident to him that against one great power, one must pit another, and that the only way to get Austria out of Italy was to use the French army. He therefore developed a master plan to provoke war with Austria, after having assured himself of French military support. Cavour's Politics of Reality. It was not difficult to persuade Napoleon III to collaborate. The Bonapartes looked upon Italy as their ancestral country, and Napoleon III, in his adventurous youth, had traveled in conspiratorial Italian circles and even participated in an Italian insurrection in 1831. Now, as emperor, 994, and as an apostle of modernity, he entertained a doctrine of nationalities that held the consolidation of nations to be a forward step at the existing stage of history. To fight reactionary Austria for the freedom of Italy would also mollify liberal opinion in France, which in other ways Napoleon was engaged in suppressing. Napoleon III therefore reached a secret agreement with Cavour. In April 1859, Cavour tricked Austria into a declaration of war. The French army poured over the Alps, 553. There were two battles, Magenta and Solferino, both won by the French and Piedmontese. But Napoleon III was now in a quandary. In Italy, with the defeat of the Austrians, revolutionary agitation broke out all over the peninsula, as it had a decade before, and the French emperor was no patron of popular revolution. The revolutionaries overthrew or denounced the existing governments and clamored for annexation to Piedmont. In France, as elsewhere, the Catholics, fearful that the Pope's temporal power would be lost, upbraided the emperor for his godless and unnecessary war. The French position was indeed odd, for while the bulk of the French army fought Austria in the north, a French military detachment was still stationed in Rome, sent there in 1849 to protect the Pope against Italian republicanism. Napoleon III, in July 1859, at the height of his victories, stupefied Cavour. He made a separate peace with the Austrians. The Franco-Austrian agreement gave Lombardy to Piedmont, but left Venetia within the Austrian Empire. It offered a compromise solution to the Italian question in the form of a federal union of the existing Italian governments to be presided over by the Pope. This was not what Cavour or the Piedmontese or the more fiery Italian patriots wanted. Revolution continued to spread across the northern Italian states. Tuscany, Modena, Parma, and Romagna drove out their old rulers. They were annexed to Piedmont after plebiscites or general elections in these regions had shown overwhelming popular favor for this step. Because Romagna belonged to the Papal States, the Pope excommunicated the organizers of the New Italy. Undeterred, representatives of all North Italy except Venetia met at the Piedmontese capital of Turin in 1860, in the first parliament of the enlarged kingdom. The British government hailed these events with 995 enthusiasm, and Napoleon III also recognized the expanded Piedmontese state in return for the transfer to France of Nice and Savoy, where plebiscites disclosed enormous majorities for annexation to France. Franco-Austrian Agreement. The completion of Italian unity. There were now, in 1860, a North Italian kingdom, the Papal States in the middle, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, ruled by a Bourbon king in Naples and still standing in the south. A Piedmontese Republican, Giuseppe Garibaldi, brought the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to a revolutionary crisis. Somewhat like Lafayette, Garibaldi was a hero of two worlds who had fought for the independence of Uruguay, lived in the United States, and been one of the triumvirs in the short-lived Roman Republic of 1849. He now organized a group of about 1,150 personal followers, Garibaldi's 1,000, or the Red Shirts, for an armed expedition that he would lead from northern Italy to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south. Garibaldi landed in Sicily and soon crossed to the mainland. Revolutionists hastened to join him, and the Bourbon government of the Two Sicilies, backward and corrupt, commanding little loyalty from its population, collapsed before this picturesque march into Naples. Garibaldi now prepared to push from Naples up to Rome. Here, of course, he would meet not only the Pope, but also the French army, and the international scandal would reverberate far beyond Italy. Cavour, examining the new opportunities with his usual pragmatism, decided that so extreme a step must be averted, but he also saw that Garibaldi's successes must be used to advance the national cause. Garibaldi, though not all his followers, was now ready to accept a monarchy as the best solution to the problem of Italian unification. The chief of the Red Shirts, the one-time foe of kings, thus consented to ride in an open carriage with the King of Piedmont, Victor Emmanuel, through the streets of Naples amid 999-6-54 cheering thousands. Plebiscites held in the Two Sicilies showed an almost unanimous willingness to join with Piedmont. In the remainder of the Papal States, except for Rome and its environs, plebiscites were held also with the same result. A parliament representing all Italy except Rome and Venetia met in 1861, and the Kingdom of Italy was formally proclaimed, with Victor Emmanuel II as king, by grace of God and the will of the nation. Venetia was added in 1866 as a reward for Italian aid to Prussia in a war against Austria. Rome was annexed in 1870 after the withdrawal of French troops in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Garibaldi's compromise nation-building, 1859 to 1867. In the 8 years after 1859, Italy was unified, except for the city of Rome, annexed in 1870, and the Habsburg government tried to solve its nationalities problem by creating the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. The maps show the political components of the new Italian nation-state and the two adjoining regions that form the Habsburg-ruled dual monarchy in Central Europe. So Italy was made, as the phrase of the time expressed it. It had been made by the high-minded cultural nationalism of Mazzini, the audacity of Garibaldi, and the cold realism of Cavour. In the end, however, the Italians also achieved national unification through insurrections, armed violence, and the endorsement of popular votes. Persistent problems air unification 997. Very little was settled or ended by unification. Even territorially, the more pronounced nationalists refused to believe that Italian unity was completed. They looked beyond to regions of mixed population where Italians were numerous or preponderant, to the Trentino, to Trieste, to certain Dalmatian islands, or to Nice and Savoy. They saw in these regions an Italia irredenta, an unredeemed Italy, awaiting in its turn the day of incorporation. Irredentism even passed into the English language as a word signifying a vociferous demand, on nationalist grounds, for annexation of regions beyond one's own frontiers. The occupation of Rome in 1870 by the Italian government further widened the rift between the Church and the Italian national movement. The Pope, deprived of territories the papacy had held for 1,555 years, renewed his condemnations of Italian nationalists and chose to remain in lifelong seclusion in the Vatican. His successors followed the same policy until 1929. Hence, good Italian patriots were bound to be anti-clerical, and good Catholics were bound to look upon the Italian state with unfriendly eyes. The regional differences between northern and southern Italy did not disappear with unification. Many nationalists in the north still looked upon the agrarian south, the land of priest, landlord, and impoverished peasant, as disgracefully backward. Occupation of Rome, 998. This photograph of Giuseppe Garibaldi suggests the confident, charismatic personal style that enabled him to lead a spirited group of Italian nationalists, or red shirts, into southern Italy, to form an alliance with King Victor Emmanuel of Piedmont, and to help establish a unified Italian nation-state. Holton Arch images? The new Italy was parliamentary but not democratic. At first, the vote was only given to some 600,000 men in a country of almost 25 million people. Not until 1913 was the male suffrage significantly broadened, and women would not gain the right to vote until 1945. Meanwhile, parliamentary life, confined to a few, was somewhat isolated from most of the population and frequently corrupt. But the political dream of ages was realized. Italy was one. The period of fragmentation and foreign rule that seemed so shameful to patriots, the long centuries that had elapsed since the Renaissance, were now terminated in the glories of a successful Risorgimento.